I stood in my childhood kitchen holding the 3-layer chocolate birthday cake I had spent 6 hours making from scratch, watching my mother blow out 60 pink candles, while our entire extended family gathered around the dining table. When my cousin Sarah asked what Mom wished for, she looked directly at me with those cold blue eyes I knew so well and declared loudly enough for all 23 relatives to hear that her perfect birthday gift would be me leaving her life forever and never coming back. The room fell completely silent except for the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I carefully set down the cake, walked upstairs to my temporary bedroom, and began methodically packing my suitcases, while guests whispered frantically below. Within 6 hours, I was executing a plan that would permanently change everything. The silence after my mother Carol's declaration felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I climbed those familiar wooden stairs for what I somehow knew would be the final time, each step creaking in the same pattern I remembered from childhood. My temporary bedroom looked exactly as I had left it that morning, with my divorce papers stacked neatly on the nightstand and my few belongings arranged carefully in the closet I had organized just 2 weeks earlier. As I pulled my largest suitcase from under the bed, my hand brushed against something small and hard, taped beneath the wooden frame. I knelt down and discovered a tiny recording device, no bigger than a button, with a blinking red light indicating it was actively capturing sound. My blood turned ice cold as I systematically searched the room and found 3 more identical devices hidden behind picture frames, inside the lamp base, and even tucked into the heating vent. Carol appeared in my doorway without knocking, her arms crossed and her mouth set in that familiar thin line that meant she was preparing for battle. She wore the same floral dress she had chosen for her birthday celebration, but now it seemed less festive and more like armor designed to project innocence while she launched her attack. "Where do you think you are going, Jackie?" she demanded, stepping into my space without invitation. "You cannot just run away because your feelings got hurt over a little joke." I held up the recording devices in my palm, watching her face change from confident to shocked to cornered in the span of 3 seconds. "Explain these, Mom. Explain why you have been secretly recording my private conversations in the bedroom you offered me after my divorce." Carol's carefully constructed mask slipped completely. Her shoulders straightened defensively, and her voice took on the sharp edge I remembered from every childhood argument. "Those are for your own protection, Jackie. You've been acting unstable since your divorce, making poor financial decisions, and saying things that worry me about your mental state. I needed documentation in case something happened, and I had to prove you were not thinking clearly." "Documentation for what exactly?" I pressed, continuing to pack while she talked, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she clearly expected. "For the inheritance discussions." She admitted the words tumbling out faster than she could control them. "Your father left you far too much in his will, and frankly, I do not think you are emotionally stable enough to handle that kind of responsibility right now. These recordings prove that you have been talking to yourself, crying at all hours, and making impulsive decisions that show poor judgment." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. She had invited me to stay with her after my divorce, offering comfort and support during the most vulnerable period of my life, only to use my grief and stress as evidence against my character. Every private phone call with my therapist, every moment of crying over my failed marriage, every conversation with friends about rebuilding my life had been captured and cataloged as ammunition for her legal strategy. So this birthday humiliation was planned. I said the pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. "You wanted witnesses to see me react poorly so you could add emotional instability to your case." Carol lifted her chin defiantly. "You brought this on yourself, Jackie. If you had just accepted a smaller portion of the inheritance gracefully, instead of questioning every decision I make, none of this would be necessary. But you always have to challenge me just like you did with your father." I pulled out my phone and called my sister-in-law Beth, who worked as a real estate agent in our small Ohio town. She answered on the second ring, probably curious about why I was calling during Carol's birthday celebration. "Beth, I need you to list the lake house immediately," I said, watching my mother's face turn pale. "Tonight, if possible. I want it on the market first thing Monday morning." "Jackie, what's going on?" Beth asked, her professional training kicking in despite her obvious confusion. "Are you sure you want to sell that property? Has been in your family for 30 years. "I inherited it legally from Dad," I replied, never breaking eye contact with Carol. "It is mine to sell, and I want it gone as quickly as possible. Price it to move fast." Carol lunged forward and tried to grab my phone, but I stepped away smoothly. The sounds of our relatives talking and laughing drifted up from the dining room below, completely unaware that the family dynamic they thought they knew was crumbling just one floor above their heads. "You cannot sell that house," Carol hissed. "That is where I spend every summer. That is where your father proposed to me. You are being vindictive and cruel." "I am being practical." I corrected, zipping my suitcase closed with finality. "You said your perfect birthday gift would be me leaving your life forever. I'm simply making sure I have the resources to grant that wish properly." As I carried my belongings toward the stairs, I could hear Carol frantically explaining to someone downstairs that I was having some kind of emotional breakdown and needed space to calm down. Her voice carried that practiced tone of concerned motherly worry that she had perfected over the years, designed to make her sound reasonable while painting me as unstable. But for the first time in my 34 years, I felt completely clear about what I needed to do next. Monday morning found me sitting in the sterile office of Hartwell Financial Services, clutching my father's old leather briefcase and trying to process what his former advisor Daniel Chen was telling me. The building smelled like coffee and printer toner, with motivational posters about retirement planning covering every available wall space. "Your father set these accounts up 7 years ago," Daniel explained, sliding a thick folder across his mahogany desk. "He was very specific about keeping them separate from any joint assets with your mother. He said there might come a time when you would need financial independence from family conflicts." I stared at the statements showing account balances that made my hands shake. $812,000 spread across 3 investment portfolios, all earning steady returns and all legally designated with my name as sole beneficiary. My father had quietly protected me from a situation he apparently saw coming long before I did. "Mom never knew about these," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He was very clear that Carol should not be informed unless something happened to him, and you needed the funds," Daniel confirmed. "He said he loved your mother, but worried about her tendency to use money as a means of control over family members. These accounts were his way of ensuring you could always choose your own path." I thought about all the times my father had encouraged me to pursue my graduate degree in family counseling, even when Carol complained about the cost and time commitment. I remembered how he always asked detailed questions about my studies and seemed genuinely proud when I completed my thesis on family dynamics and financial abuse. Now I understood he had been preparing me for this exact situation. "There is something else." Daniel continued, opening a sealed envelope. "Your father also transferred ownership of the lake house to you through a trust structure that would activate if certain family conflicts arose. Technically, you have owned that property outright for 3 years. The irony was perfect. My mother had spent the weekend painting me as financially irresponsible and emotionally unstable, while I actually held more assets and legal authority than she imagined. I immediately called Beth to expedite the lake house sale and connected with a property management company to handle the transfer. By Wednesday afternoon, I was signing papers to list the house at 90% of market value to ensure a quick sale. The property management company, Henderson Realty Group, specialized in handling difficult family situations and understood the need for discretion and speed. My phone started ringing before I even left their office. Carol had somehow discovered the listing and was calling every 5 minutes, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails about my reckless decision to sell our family legacy. Her messages progressed from attempts at guilt and manipulation to outright threats about legal action. But Daniel had prepared me for this reaction. Every document was legally airtight, every transfer had been properly executed, and every asset was completely under my control. My father had anticipated my mother's tactics and built protections that even her lawyer could not challenge. The most satisfying moment came Thursday evening when I received a call from my cousin David, who managed the family's small rental business. Carol had contacted him about using the lake house for a family reunion in August, only to discover that the property was no longer available and would be sold to strangers within weeks. "Jackie, I do not understand what is happening," David said, his confusion obvious even over the phone. "Aunt Carol said you are having some kind of breakdown and making crazy financial decisions, but the sale paperwork looks completely professional and legitimate." "There is no breakdown, David," I assured him. "I am simply choosing to manage my inherited assets in ways that support my independence. If that seems crazy to certain family members, perhaps they should examine why my financial autonomy threatens them so much." After ending the call, I sat in my hotel room looking over my father's final letter, which Daniel had given me, along with the account information. In his careful handwriting, he had explained his concerns about Carol's increasing need to control family members through financial pressure and emotional manipulation. He wrote about watching her systematically isolate me from other relatives by sharing twisted versions of my private struggles and painting me as ungrateful and difficult. "My greatest fear," his letter concluded, "is that your mother will use my death as an opportunity to consolidate power over everyone she believes she can control. These accounts are my promise that you will always have the means to choose love over obligation, authenticity, over peacekeeping, and your own happiness over family politics." As I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the briefcase, I realized my father had given me something more valuable than money. He had given me permission to prioritize my own well-being without guilt or apology. 3 weeks later, I was standing in my new studio apartment in Portland, Oregon, watching rain streak down the windows while unpacking boxes labeled with my newly registered business entity, named Sunrise Family Mediation LLC. The apartment was small but bright with hardwood floors and a view of the Willamette River that made me feel like I was starting a completely new chapter of my life. Portland had appealed to me specifically because it was far enough from Ohio to make casual visits impossible, but close enough to major cities that I could build a professional practice, helping other families navigate the same toxic dynamics I had escaped. The irony of becoming a family mediator after fleeing my own family chaos was not lost on me, but it felt like the perfect way to transform my painful experiences into something meaningful. I had barely finished setting up my home office when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Margaret Torres, who identified herself as a court investigator from Ohio. "Ms. Jackie Martinez," she said in a professional tone that immediately put me on alert. "I am calling regarding emergency court proceedings filed by your mother, Carol Martinez. She has petitioned for a temporary guardianship order, claiming you are experiencing a mental health crisis that has impaired your ability to make sound financial decisions." My stomach dropped as I realized Carol was escalating her strategy. Having failed to manipulate me directly, she was now trying to use the legal system to strip away my autonomy and force me back under her control. "What specific evidence has she provided for these claims?" I asked, grabbing a notepad to document everything Margaret said. "She submitted the recordings from your stay at her house, along with testimony from family members about your sudden departure and immediate property sale. She claims these behaviors indicate a psychological break that requires intervention before you cause further harm to yourself and your family's financial stability. I would like to schedule a meeting to provide context for those recordings and evidence of my current mental state," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the anger burning in my chest. "I think you will find that my departure and financial decisions were reasonable responses to a toxic family situation, not symptoms of mental illness." Margaret agreed to meet me the following week at a neutral location in Cleveland. I spent the next several days preparing a comprehensive presentation that included my business registration documents, bank statements, showing responsible financial management references from my therapist and divorce attorney, and most importantly, a detailed timeline of Carol's manipulative behaviors leading up to my departure. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the courthouse with Margaret reviewing my materials while I calmly explained the context behind each recording Carol had submitted. I showed her how the conversations had been edited to remove Carol's provocative statements and my reasonable responses, leaving only my emotional reactions to appear unstable. These recordings were made without my knowledge while I was staying in my mother's home as a guest, I explained. They captured my private processing of a difficult divorce, but they were deliberately edited to misrepresent my mental state. I can provide testimony from my therapist confirming that my emotional responses were completely normal for someone navigating major life transitions. Margaret's expression grew increasingly skeptical as she reviewed Carol's evidence against my comprehensive documentation. When I showed her the property transfer documents proving my father had legally designated me as the lake house owner years earlier, her eyebrows raised significantly. "So, your mother filed for guardianship partly based on your sale of property that you have legally owned for 3 years?" she asked. "Correct. She also failed to mention that she was secretly recording me to build a case for removing me from my inheritance, or that her birthday declaration about wanting me out of her life was witnessed by 23 family members." The investigation took another 2 weeks, during which Margaret interviewed several family members and reviewed financial records from both sides. The results were devastating for Carol's case and vindicating for my decision to establish independence. Not only did Margaret dismiss the guardianship petition, but she filed a report recommending that Carol be investigated for potential financial abuse and fraudulent court filings. The court issued a temporary restraining order, preventing Carol from contacting me directly or making additional legal claims without substantial evidence. The most satisfying part of the entire process was receiving copies of Margaret's interviews with family members. Several relatives admitted they had felt pressured to support Carol's version of events, but when questioned directly, they acknowledged that my behavior had seemed reasonable given the circumstances. My cousin David even told Margaret that he suspected Carol had been manipulating family finances for years. As I sat in my new apartment reading Margaret's final report, I felt a profound sense of validation. Every decision I had made since walking away from Carol's birthday party had been vindicated by an objective, legal professional. My mental health was sound, my financial choices were responsible, and my assessment of my family's toxic dynamics was accurate. For the first time in months, I felt completely confident that I had chosen the right path, even if it meant rebuilding my life entirely from scratch. Carol's world began unraveling the moment she received Margaret's investigative report and the court's restraining order. I learned about her reaction through a series of increasingly desperate voicemails she left for my cousin Sarah, who felt obligated to forward them to me as evidence of Carol's deteriorating state. In the first message, Carol ranted about corrupt court systems and investigators who obviously did not understand family dynamics. By the third message, recorded just 2 days later, she was sobbing about losing her only daughter and not understanding how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The transformation from manipulative authority figure to confused victim would have been heartbreaking if I had not lived through years of her calculated cruelty. The turning point came when Carol decided to search through my father's personal belongings for anything that might support her legal case. She had avoided cleaning out his desk since his death 18 months earlier, but desperation finally drove her to tackle the painful task of sorting through his papers and personal effects. Hidden in the back corner of the desk's bottom drawer, she discovered a small brass key attached to a safety deposit box receipt from First National Bank. The box number matched no records Carol had ever seen, and the rental fees had been automatically deducted from one of my father's personal accounts that she had assumed contained only minimal amounts. When she visited the bank with proper documentation proving her status as his widow, the contents of the safety deposit box shattered her understanding of her marriage and her husband's final months. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed to Carol in my father's handwriting, along with copies of all the financial documents that had established my independence fund and property transfers. The letter was 12 pages long and written in the careful, thoughtful style my father had always used for important communications. He explained his growing concerns about Carol's need to control family members through financial pressure and emotional manipulation. He documented specific incidents where she had used money to force relatives into compliance with her wishes, including threatening to withhold college funding from David's daughter, unless he sided with Carol in a family dispute. Most devastating for Carol was my father's detailed account of her secret gambling addiction, which had cost their family nearly $40,000 over 5 years. He wrote about discovering her online poker accounts, her hidden credit card debts, and her pattern of borrowing money from relatives under false pretenses to cover her losses. "I love you, Carol." The letter concluded, "But I cannot allow your need for control and your financial problems to destroy our daughter's future. Jackie deserves the opportunity to build a life free from manipulation and emotional blackmail. These accounts and property transfers are my way of ensuring that our family's toxic patterns end with my generation." Carol called Sarah immediately after reading the letter, her voice shaky and defeated, in a way none of us had ever heard before. Sarah later told me that Carol kept repeating that she never realized her husband saw her behavior as manipulative, insisting that everything she did was motivated by love and concern for family unity. "He thought I was manipulating people." Carol sobbed into the phone. "He thought I was some kind of monster who enjoyed hurting her own family. How could he believe that about me? How could he protect Jackie from me like I was some kind of threat?" But even in her moment of revelation, Carol could not resist attempting to manipulate the situation to her advantage. She began calling extended family members to share selective portions of the letter, emphasizing my father's expressions of love for her, while omitting his specific concerns about her behavior. She told my Aunt Susan that my father had been confused in his final months and probably influenced by my constant complaining about family dynamics. She suggested to my cousin David that the gambling references were exaggerated and taken out of context. She even attempted to convince my brother Mark that the letter was evidence of my father's declining mental state, rather than legitimate concerns about her conduct. The problem with Carol's strategy was that Margaret's investigation had already alerted family members to the pattern of manipulation Carol typically employed. Instead of accepting her explanations, at face value, relatives began comparing notes and asking more detailed questions about the letter's contents and Carol's financial history. When Sarah asked to see the complete letter rather than just the excerpts Carol had shared, Carol became defensive and claimed the full document was too personal and painful for others to read. This response only increased family members' suspicions that Carol was once again controlling information to protect her preferred narrative. The final blow to Carol's credibility came when my Aunt Susan contacted me directly to ask about my father's concerns. I was able to provide specific examples of the financial manipulation he had referenced, including Carol's pattern of creating artificial emergencies to pressure relatives into providing money she never repaid. As word spread through the family that Carol's victim narrative was contradicted by my father's carefully documented observations, her support network began dissolving. The relatives who had initially sided with her story about my breakdown and abandonment started questioning whether they had been given accurate information about our family conflict. For the first time in decades, Carol found herself isolated and unable to control other people's perceptions of family events. The power she had wielded through information management and emotional manipulation was evaporating as family members chose to seek truth rather than accept her version of reality. 2 months into my Portland life, I was settling into a routine of morning runs along the riverfront when my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from someone I hadn't heard from in years. The profile picture showed a lanky teenager with sandy brown hair and a hesitant smile that reminded me immediately of my brother Mark at that age. "Hi, Aunt Jackie," the message read. "This is Ryan Mark's son. I know we haven't talked since I was little, but I really need to ask you something important. Can we video chat sometime when my parents aren't around?" Ryan was now 17, a senior in high school, who I remembered as a curious kid who always asked thoughtful questions during family gatherings. I hadn't seen him since my father's funeral, where he had seemed unusually withdrawn and anxious for a teenager dealing with normal grief. We arranged to connect that evening while his parents were at their weekly bowling league. When his face appeared on my laptop screen, I was struck by how much he resembled Mark, but with an underlying tension that seemed far too mature for his age. "Aunt Jackie, I need to tell you something about Grandma Carol." He began glancing nervously toward his bedroom door. "Ever since you left, she's been coming over way more often, and she keeps saying things about you that don't make sense with what I remember." "What kind of things, Ryan?" "She tells my parents that you had some kind of mental breakdown and abandoned your family when they needed you most. But she also talks to me privately and says completely different stuff. She tells me that you were always jealous of her relationship with Grandpa and that you manipulated him into leaving you money that should have gone to her." I felt my stomach clench as Ryan continued describing conversations that revealed the extent of Carol's manipulation tactics with family members of different generations. "But here's the really weird part," Ryan said, lowering his voice even further. "She's been asking me lots of questions about my college plans and my relationship with my parents. She keeps suggesting that Mom and Dad don't really understand me like she does and that I should talk to her about problems instead of them." The pattern was sickeningly familiar. Carol was using the same isolation techniques on Ryan that she had perfected with me over the years, gradually positioning herself as his primary emotional support while undermining his trust in his parents. "Ryan, has she mentioned anything about your college fund or financial aid applications?" His face darkened immediately. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. She told me last week that she's been contributing to my college savings and that she might need to reconsider that support if I maintain contact with family members who are toxic influences on our family. She didn't say your name specifically, but it was pretty obvious what she meant." I felt rage building in my chest as I realized Carol was holding a 17-year-old's educational future hostage to control his family loyalties. She was essentially threatening to destroy his college opportunities unless he participated in ostracizing me. "Has she asked you to do anything specific regarding me or your parents?" "She wants me to write down conversations I overhear between Mom and Dad about you or about family money. She says she's worried they might be making poor financial decisions because they feel guilty about how you were treated. She gave me this little notebook and asked me to keep track of anything that might be important for family financial planning." The sophistication of Carol's manipulation was breathtaking. She was turning my teenage nephew into an unwitting spy in his own home, while convincing him that this surveillance was necessary to protect the family's financial stability. "Ryan, I want you to know that everything she's telling you about me is false," I said carefully. "I left because she was recording my private conversations and planning to use them to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could control my inheritance. I have legal documents proving that everything I did was reasonable and necessary." I spent the next hour walking Ryan through the truth about my departure, the court investigation, and the restraining order. I explained how manipulative people often use financial threats to control family members, and how his grandmother was attempting to isolate him from his parents' love and support. "The scariest part," Ryan admitted near the end of our conversation, "is that she makes it all sound so reasonable when she's talking to me. She acts like she's the only person who really cares about my future and wants to protect me from making the same mistakes other family members have made." "That's exactly how manipulation works," I explained. "It feels like love and protection, but it's actually about control and power. People who genuinely love you want you to make your own informed decisions, not comply with their demands out of fear." Before ending our call, I connected Ryan with Dr. Angela Foster, a family therapist in Cleveland, who specialized in helping teenagers navigate toxic family dynamics. I also reached out to my Aunt Susan, who lived in Texas, and had maintained a loving relationship with Ryan since his childhood, asking her to increase her contact with him as an alternative source of emotional support. Most importantly, I encouraged Ryan to start documenting Carol's manipulative statements and financial threats, not to use against her, but to help him recognize the patterns and protect himself from further psychological manipulation. The call ended with Ryan promising to reach out to Dr. Foster and to contact me immediately if Carol escalated her threats or demands. As I closed my laptop, I realized that my escape from Carol's toxicity had inadvertently exposed her to greater scrutiny from other family members, leading her to intensify her control tactics with more vulnerable targets. Ryan was not just my nephew, he was Carol's next victim, and I was possibly the only family member positioned to help him recognize and resist her manipulation before it derailed his future. The following Saturday morning, I was brewing coffee in my Portland kitchen when my phone rang with a call from my Aunt Susan in Dallas. Her voice carried an urgency I had rarely heard from my father's normally calm and diplomatic sister. "Jackie, I need to drive up to see you this week," she said without preamble. "I have been talking to Ryan and several other family members, and there are things you need to know about Carol's behavior that go back much further than any of us realized." Susan arrived Tuesday afternoon carrying a thick manila folder and looking more serious than I had ever seen her. At 58, she had always been the family's quiet peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and helped everyone maintain civil relationships despite underlying tensions. I should have spoken up years ago. She began as we settled in my living room overlooking the river. I kept telling myself that Carol's behavior was just her personality and that families always have difficult dynamics. But after talking to Ryan and learning about what she did to you, I cannot stay silent anymore. Susan opened her folder and spread out documents that made my hands shake as I recognized the scope of what she had been quietly documenting. There were printed emails, handwritten notes with dates and times, and even several audio recordings she had made during family gatherings over the past 5 years. "I started keeping records after Carol tried to sabotage David's business startup," Susan explained. She convinced 3 family members not to invest in his company by telling them David was financially irresponsible and that the business plan was unrealistic. What she did not tell them was that David had refused to give her a personal loan the month before, and this was her way of punishing him. The emails Susan showed me contained conversations between Carol and various relatives, where she systematically shared distorted information about David's finances, his marriage, and his business capabilities. She had painted him as unstable and unreliable, using carefully selected facts taken out of context to support her character assassination. David's company failed partly because he could not secure adequate startup funding, Susan continued. Carol's sabotage cost him at least $60,000 in potential family investment, which might have been enough to keep the business viable through its first difficult year. But David's situation was only the beginning of what Susan had documented. She had recordings of Carol admitting that she enjoyed teaching lessons to family members who challenged her authority. In one particularly damaging audio clip, Carol could be heard laughing about how she had convinced Mark and his wife that I was jealous of their marriage and trying to create problems between them. "Listen to this," Susan said, playing a recording from my cousin Beth's wedding reception 2 years earlier. Carol's voice was clear and unmistakable as she spoke to a group of relatives near the bar. "Jackie has always been jealous of anyone who has what she wants," Carol said in the recording. "She could not keep her own marriage together, so now she wants to interfere with everyone else's happiness. Mark and his wife need to be very careful about how much personal information they share with her." I felt sick listening to my mother systematically poisoning my relationships with family members by attributing motives and behaviors to me that existed only in her imagination. Susan fast-forwarded to another section where Carol discussed her strategy for managing family dynamics. "The The key is to make sure information flows through me. Carol explained to someone whose voice I could not identify. If people talk directly to each other without me involved, they might compare notes and realize that I have given them different versions of the same story. As long as I control who knows what, I can prevent the kind of conflicts that tear families apart. The irony was stunning. Carol was describing her technique for creating and managing conflicts while presenting herself as the person working to prevent them. She was the puppet master pulling strings to create drama, then positioning herself as the wise mediator who could restore peace. "There's more," Susan said, pulling out a notebook filled with her careful handwriting. "I have been tracking her financial requests from family members. In the past 3 years, she has borrowed money from 6 different relatives under various pretenses, and she has not repaid any of them." The list was staggering. Carol had requested emergency funds from Mark when she claimed her roof needed urgent repairs, borrowed money from David for what she said was a medical expense, and asked Susan for help with car repairs that apparently never happened. The total amount exceeded $50,000 across multiple family members who had never discussed these loans with each other. "She always makes the requests sound urgent and temporary," Susan explained. "She provides just enough detail to sound credible, but she never offers documentation or follow-up information. And she always asks people not to mention the loans to other family members because she feels embarrassed about needing help." The pattern was sophisticated and deliberate. Carol had identified each family member's emotional vulnerabilities and crafted her requests accordingly. She told Mark she needed help because his father would have wanted him to take care of his mother. She convinced David that supporting her was his way of honoring family loyalty. She assured Susan that the assistance was temporary and would prevent more serious problems later. What finally made me start recording conversations was when I realized she was telling each of us different stories about the same events. Susan said, "She told me you were financially irresponsible, but she told David you were selfish with money. She told Mark you were trying to isolate yourself from family, but she told Beth you were being overly clingy and demanding attention." As Susan continued sharing her documentation, I began to understand that my departure had not caused Carol's manipulative behavior. It had simply exposed patterns that had been operating for years. My escape had disrupted her ability to control information flow and manage different family members' perceptions of reality. "The other relatives are starting to compare notes," Susan concluded. "David called me after talking to Ryan, and he is furious about how Carol sabotaged his business. Mark is questioning why his mother has been so involved in his family's financial decisions. Even Beth is starting to remember conversations that did not make sense at the time." Susan's documentation provided the evidence needed to demonstrate that Carol's manipulation of me was part of a larger pattern of abusive behavior toward multiple family members. More importantly, it showed that several relatives were ready to work together to protect Ryan and hold Carol accountable for her destructive actions. For the first time since leaving Ohio, I felt like I was not alone in recognizing the truth about my family's dynamics. My consulting practice had been operating for 6 months when I received an invitation to speak at Portland's Family Business Network quarterly meeting. The topic was navigating family conflicts in business settings, and the organizer had specifically requested someone with both professional training in family mediation and personal experience with complex family dynamics. The presentation went better than I had anticipated. My approach of combining academic research with real-world applications resonated with an audience of business owners who were struggling to maintain professional relationships while managing family tensions. During the networking reception afterward, several attendees approached me with specific questions about my consulting services. The most intriguing conversation was with Amanda Richardson, a poised woman in her early 40s, who introduced herself as CEO of Richardson Family Mediation Services. She had an impressive background in corporate mediation and had recently expanded her practice to focus specifically on family business conflicts. "Your presentation today was exactly what I have been looking for," Amanda said as we found a quiet corner to continue our conversation. I have been searching for a partner who understands both the business and emotional aspects of family conflict. Most mediators are strong in one area, but struggle with the intersection. As we talked, I realized that Amanda and I had attended the same high school in Ohio, though she was 3 years ahead of me, and we had never directly interacted. She remembered me as the student council treasurer, who had organized successful fundraising campaigns, and I vaguely recalled her as the debate team captain who had won state championships. "I have a proposal for you," Amanda said, handing me her business card. "I am bidding on a contract with a major family foundation that owns several businesses across the Pacific Northwest. They need a comprehensive mediation team to help resolve conflicts between family members who serve on various boards of directors. The contract is worth $200,000 over 18 months. The opportunity was exactly what I had hoped to build toward, but much sooner than I had expected. Amanda explained that her firm had the corporate mediation expertise, but they lacked someone with specific training in family psychology and toxic relationship patterns. "Your background is perfect for this," she continued. "You have the academic credentials, the professional training, and unfortunately, the personal experience to understand how family manipulation affects business decision-making. Plus, your recent success in extricating yourself from a toxic family situation demonstrates that you can help others navigate similar challenges." I was surprised to learn that Amanda had researched my background thoroughly before approaching me. She had spoken with Daniel Chen, my father's financial advisor, who had mentioned my successful handling of the inheritance conflicts and legal challenges. She had also contacted Dr. Foster, the therapist I had recommended to Ryan, who had provided professional references about my understanding of family dynamics. "The irony is not lost on me," I admitted. 6 months ago, I was fleeing my own family's dysfunction, and now I am being offered a major contract to help other families resolve similar problems. "That's exactly why this partnership makes sense," Amanda replied. "You understand these dynamics from the inside, not just from textbooks. You know how manipulation tactics feel when you are experiencing them, and you know what it takes to break free and rebuild healthy boundaries." We spent the following week developing a joint proposal that combined Amanda's corporate mediation framework with my family psychology expertise. The proposal included detailed strategies for identifying manipulation patterns, protecting vulnerable family members, and establishing sustainable communication structures. The foundation that had requested the proposal was the Hartwell Family Foundation, which owned timber companies, real estate developments, and technology startups across Oregon and Washington. 3 generations of family members served in various leadership roles, and recent conflicts over expansion strategies had created deadlocks that were affecting all their business operations. When we presented our proposal to the Foundation's board, I recognized several dynamics that mirrored my own family's patterns. There was an older generation matriarch who controlled information flow between family members, younger family members who felt excluded from decision-making processes, and business decisions that were being influenced more by personal relationships than by financial considerations. "We have tried traditional business mediation," explained Jonathan Hartwell, the Foundation's current president, "but our conflicts are not really about business strategy. They are about family roles, communication patterns, and unresolved emotional issues that affect how we work together professionally." Amanda and I were awarded the contract 3 weeks later. The Hartwell Foundation's leadership recognized that their business problems were fundamentally family problems that required specialized intervention. Our 18-month engagement would include individual assessments of all family members involved in business operations, group mediation sessions, and the development of new governance structures that separated family relationships from business decision-making. The success of this contract led to referrals from other family business networks across the region. Within 8 months, Sunrise Family Mediation had grown from a one-person consulting practice to a partnership with Amanda that employed 4 additional mediators and maintained a waiting list of potential clients. The most satisfying aspect of this professional growth was that my expertise had developed directly from surviving and escaping the same toxic patterns that our clients were experiencing. I could recognize manipulation tactics immediately because I had lived through them. I could help family members establish healthy boundaries because I had learned to enforce my own. I could guide people toward financial and emotional independence because I had successfully achieved both. My business success became a source of validation that my decision to leave my family had been not only necessary for my own well-being, but it also created opportunities to help dozens of other families avoid the destruction I had experienced. The pain Carol had caused me was being transformed into healing and empowerment for other people facing similar challenges. It was a humid Saturday afternoon in late July when my phone rang with a call from my brother Mark. I was reviewing case files for upcoming mediation sessions when I saw his name on the caller ID and felt the familiar knot of anxiety that came with any unexpected contact from Ohio. "Jackie, I need to tell you something," Mark said, his voice strained in a way I had never heard before. "Mom collapsed at David's barbecue this afternoon. She's in the hospital and the doctors think she had a heart attack." The news hit me like a physical blow despite everything that had happened between Carol and me over the past year. Whatever our conflicts, she was still my mother, and the thought of her suffering alone in a hospital room made my chest tighten with complicated emotions. "Is she stable?" I asked, setting aside my work materials and focusing completely on Mark's update. "The doctors say she is out of immediate danger, but they want to keep her for several days for monitoring and tests. Jackie, I know things between you two have been really difficult, but I thought you should know what happened." Mark went on to explain that Carol had been hosting her usual summer barbecue when she suddenly complained of chest pains and difficulty breathing. The paramedics had arrived within minutes, but she had been unconscious by the time they loaded her into the ambulance. "Was there anything specific that might have triggered this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "She's been under a lot of stress lately," Mark admitted. "She's been obsessing about the family conflicts and spending hours every day calling relatives to discuss what happened between you two. Susan told her last week that several family members have been questioning Mom's version of events, and I think that really upset her." The irony was devastating. Carol's desperate attempts to control the family narrative after my departure had created exactly the kind of scrutiny and pressure that she had always tried to avoid. Her manipulative tactics were being exposed, her financial schemes were being discovered, and her authority over family dynamics was crumbling, precisely because she could not accept losing control over one family member. "I know this is complicated for you," Mark continued, "but I wanted to give you the option to decide what feels right. No one expects you to drop everything and rush back here, but if you want to visit or call the hospital, I can give you the information." I spent the next 2 hours walking along the Willamette River, processing the conflicting emotions that Carol's medical crisis had triggered. Part of me felt genuine concern for her physical well-being and sadness about the circumstances that had led to such extreme stress. But another part of me recognized that this health crisis might become yet another opportunity for Carol to manipulate family dynamics and generate sympathy for her victim narrative. That evening, I called Mercy General Hospital and asked to speak with Carol's nurse. The woman who answered, Jennifer Walsh, had a kind but professional voice that immediately put me at ease. "I'm calling about my mother, Carol Martinez," I explained. "I live out of state, and I wanted to check on her condition and see if there is anything I should know about her care." "Are you the daughter who lives in Oregon?" Jennifer asked. "Your mother has mentioned you several times since she was admitted." "What has she said?" There was a pause before Jennifer responded, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "She has been quite emotional about family relationships and seems very distressed about conflicts with various family members. She has mentioned feeling abandoned during a difficult time and worrying that people she loves have turned against her." Has she said anything specific about the circumstances that led to these family conflicts? Another pause. Ms. Martinez, I probably should not share details about patient conversations, but your mother did say some things that concerned me about her understanding of recent family events. She seems to believe that you left Ohio because of a mental health crisis, and she has expressed guilt about not recognizing the severity of your condition. The manipulation was continuing even from a hospital bed. Carol was positioning herself as the concerned mother who had failed to protect her mentally ill daughter rather than acknowledging her role in creating the family conflict through deliberate manipulation and emotional abuse. But then Jennifer's voice took on a different tone. However, I should mention that your mother has also made some statements that seem inconsistent with the story she tells visitors. When she was heavily medicated after the procedure, she said some things about feeling jealous of your relationship with your father and regretting how she had treated you over the years. I felt my heart rate spike as I realized that Carol's medical vulnerability had led her to reveal truths she would never admit under normal circumstances. What specifically did she say? She talked about being jealous because your father always seemed prouder of you than of her, and she admitted that she had tried to drive you away because your relationship with him made her feel excluded. She said she realized too late that she had destroyed her relationship with her daughter because she could not handle sharing your father's attention. This confession was everything I had suspected but never had confirmed. Carol's cruelty toward me had been motivated not by legitimate concerns about my behavior or choices, but by jealousy over my close relationship with my father and resentment about feeling less important to him than I was. Ms. Martinez. Jennifer continued, I'm documenting these conversations in your mother's medical record because they may be relevant to her psychological state and recovery process. I wanted you to know because she has been asking the staff to contact you, but she has also been telling visitors that you are avoiding her during her time of need. The truth was finally emerging, but only because Carol's medical crisis had temporarily stripped away her ability to maintain her carefully constructed public persona. Under the influence of medication and physical stress, she was revealing the real motivations behind years of manipulative behavior. As I ended the call with Jennifer, I realized that I was facing a decision that would define the next phase of my relationship with my family. I could use Carol's vulnerability as an opportunity for reconciliation, or I could maintain my boundaries while she was too weak to engage in her usual manipulation tactics. Either choice would come with consequences, but for the first time in our relationship, I would be making that decision from a position of strength rather than fear. After 3 days of internal debate, I decided to fly back to Ohio to visit Carol in the hospital. My decision was motivated not by guilt or family pressure, but by a desire to see for myself whether her medical crisis had created genuine opportunities for honesty and healing between us. I booked a red-eye flight that would arrive Thursday morning and planned to return to Portland by Sunday evening. The trip would be brief but sufficient to assess Carol's condition and determine whether she was capable of engaging in authentic conversation about our relationship. Amanda offered to handle my mediation appointments, and I arranged for Ryan to pick me up at the Cleveland airport. During the 2-hour drive to the hospital, Ryan updated me on Carol's condition and the family dynamics that had emerged during her hospitalization. She keeps asking everyone to call you, Ryan explained as we navigated morning traffic. But she also keeps telling visitors that you are probably too busy with your new life to care about your sick mother. It's like she wants you here, but she also wants to make sure everyone knows that you are not here. The manipulation was predictable, but I felt better prepared to handle it after months of professional training in recognizing and responding to toxic relationship patterns. I knew Carol would attempt to use her illness to generate sympathy while simultaneously punishing me for establishing independence. When we arrived at Mercy General, I asked Ryan to wait in the lobby while I visited Carol alone. I wanted our initial interaction to be private, without an audience that might encourage her to perform for others rather than engage authentically with me. Carol's room was on the cardiac unit's 3rd floor, and she was awake when I arrived, though she looked smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Her hair was uncombed, her face was pale without makeup, and the hospital equipment surrounding her bed made her appear vulnerable in a way that triggered unexpected protective instincts. Jackie. she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was not sure you would come." "I wanted to see how you are doing," I replied, taking a seat in the visitor's chair but maintaining physical distance. "The doctors say you are stable, which is a relief." "I have been thinking about a lot of things while I have been lying here." Carol continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I think maybe I have not been the mother you needed me to be." For a moment, I felt hopeful that her medical crisis had created space for genuine reflection and accountability. But then I heard voices approaching in the hallway outside her room, and Carol's expression shifted subtly as she prepared for an audience. My Aunt Susan entered the room, followed by two women I recognized from Carol's church group. Their faces showed a mixture of surprise and relief at seeing me, as if my presence confirmed that family healing was possible, despite recent conflicts. "Oh, Jackie, thank goodness you came," said Barbara, one of Carol's longtime friends. "Your poor mother has been so worried that you would not find out about her condition in time to say goodbye if something terrible happened." "Goodbye," I repeated, looking back at Carol with confusion. "The doctors told my brother that you are stable and expected to recover fully." Carol's eyes flickered with something that looked like annoyance before she responded. "Well, of course I am feeling better now that my daughter is here. I was just so afraid that I might not survive this without having a chance to reconcile with you after you abandoned me during such a difficult time." The word abandoned hit me like a slap, and I realized that Carol was using my visit as an opportunity to reinforce her victim narrative rather than engage in honest conversation about our relationship. "I did not abandon you," I said calmly but firmly. "I left Ohio after you publicly humiliated me and secretly recorded my private conversations to build a legal case against my mental competency. I established independence from a toxic family dynamic, which is very different from abandonment." The room fell silent as Carol's friends processed this information, which obviously contradicted the version of events Carol had shared with them. Susan shifted uncomfortably, and Barbara looked confused about how to respond to the tension that had suddenly filled the space. "Jackie, your mother is recovering from a serious medical procedure," Barbara said in a tone that suggested I was being inappropriately confrontational. "Perhaps this is not the time to relitigate old family disputes." "You are right," I agreed. "This is not the appropriate time or place for that conversation, but it is also not appropriate for my visit to be mischaracterized as evidence that I was wrong to establish healthy boundaries for myself." I stood up and told Carol that I was glad she was recovering well and that I would check with the nurses about her care plan. Then I walked toward the door where I could hear Carol beginning to explain to her visitors that my outburst proved I was still struggling with the emotional problems that had caused our family conflict originally. The manipulation was so practiced and smooth that I almost admired its efficiency. Within minutes, Carol had transformed my visit from a gesture of concern into evidence supporting her portrayal of me as unstable and cruel. She was using her illness not to create opportunities for healing, but to reinforce the same toxic patterns that had driven me away in the first place. As I walked back toward the lobby to find Ryan, I felt a profound sense of clarity about my decision to maintain boundaries with Carol, regardless of her medical condition. Her physical vulnerability had not created emotional growth or genuine remorse. Instead, it had simply provided her with new opportunities to manipulate family dynamics while positioning herself as the victim of my supposed cruelty and abandonment. The visit had served its purpose, but not in the way I had hoped. Instead of opening doors for reconciliation, it had confirmed that Carol remained committed to her manipulative patterns, even when facing serious health challenges. The family meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in the hospital's conference room, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and chairs arranged in a circle that was supposed to encourage open communication. Carol had been moved to a regular room by then, and her doctor had cleared her to participate in what everyone assumed would be a supportive discussion about her recovery and ongoing care needs. Mark had organized the gathering, inviting extended family members to coordinate assistance during Carol's transition back home. Susan flew in from Texas, David drove down from Columbus, and even my cousin Sarah made the trip from Indianapolis with her teenage daughter, Emma. The group represented most of our close family members, many of whom had not been in the same room together since my father's funeral. I arrived early and chose a seat near the window where I could observe everyone's reactions without feeling trapped by the family dynamics. Ryan entered shortly after me, carrying a small backpack that seemed heavier than necessary for a simple family meeting. His expression was more serious than I had seen since our first video call months earlier. Carol was wheeled in by a hospital aide and positioned at what everyone assumed was the head of the circle, though she looked uncomfortable being the center of attention for medical reasons rather than social control. She wore a flowered robe that made her appear more vulnerable than authoritative, and her voice was still weak from the medications and stress of recent days. "I want to thank everyone for coming." Mark began consulting notes he had prepared about care coordination and household assistance. "The doctors say Mom should be able to go home Tuesday, but she will need help with daily activities for a few weeks while she regains her strength." The conversation proceeded normally for the first 20 minutes, with various family members volunteering to handle grocery shopping, meal preparation, and transportation, to follow up medical appointments. Carol accepted these offers graciously, while making subtle comments about being grateful that most of her family was willing to support her during difficult times. But then Ryan stood up and cleared his throat in a way that immediately commanded attention from everyone in the room. "Before we finish planning support for Grandma, I think there are some things everyone needs to hear," he said, his voice steadier than I would have expected from a 17-year-old addressing a room full of anxious adults. "I have been recording some of my conversations with Grandma over the past few months, and I think you all deserve to know what she has been saying about family members when you are not around." The room went completely silent except for the sound of Carol's sharp intake of breath. Ryan reached into his backpack and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind students use to capture lectures, and placed it on the table in the center of our circle. "Ryan, honey, I do not think this is appropriate." Carol said, her voice suddenly stronger despite her supposed weakness. "Whatever private conversations you and I have had should stay between us, especially while I'm recovering from a serious medical procedure. These conversations are not private anymore when they involve threats about my college fund and instructions to spy on my parents." Ryan replied, his determination growing as he spoke. "Everyone needs to hear what you have been asking me to do, and what you have been saying about them behind their backs." Susan leaned forward in her chair, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. "What kind of threats, Ryan?" Instead of answering directly, Ryan pressed play on the recorder. Carol's voice filled the room with startling clarity, captured during what sounded like a private conversation in her kitchen. "Ryan, you need to understand that your Aunt Jackie is mentally unstable and dangerous to our family's financial security." Carol's recorded voice explained with the patient tone of someone educating a child. "She has always been jealous of the attention your grandfather gave me, and now she is trying to destroy our family out of spite. If you maintain contact with her, it tells me that you do not care about family loyalty, and I will have to reconsider my contributions to your college fund." Mark's face went white as he heard his mother threatening his son's educational future to control his family relationships. David sat back in his chair as if he had been physically struck, and Sarah's daughter, Emma, looked around the room with the wide-eyed expression of someone witnessing adult behavior that made no sense. But Ryan was not finished. He fast-forwarded to another section and played a recording that made my stomach clench with recognition. "The key to managing family conflicts," Carol's voice continued, "is making sure that different family members hear different versions of the same events. If Ryan's parents think Jackie abandoned me out of selfishness, and if Jackie's supporters think I am the victim of her mental breakdown, then no one compares notes and realizes that I am controlling the information everyone receives." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Carol was staring at Ryan with a mixture of fury and panic, obviously calculating how much damage these recordings could cause to her carefully maintained reputation. "There's more." Ryan said, his confidence building as he realized the impact his evidence was having on the family. She also talks about enjoying the power she has over people and admits that she lies to create conflicts between family members. The next recording was the most damaging of all. Carol's voice was clearly identifiable as she spoke to someone I could not identify, but her tone was casual and almost gleeful. "I have been borrowing money from different family members for years, and none of them discuss it with each other, because I tell them all to keep it confidential. David thinks he loaned me money for car repairs. Mark thinks it was for medical expenses, and Susan thinks it was for home maintenance. The truth is, I have been using the money for my online poker games, but they will never figure that out as long as they do not compare notes." David shot to his feet so abruptly that his chair fell backward. "You told me that money was for emergency surgery that your insurance did not cover. You made me feel guilty for hesitating to help with a medical crisis, and you were using it for gambling. And you told me the car repair story." Susan added, her voice shaking with anger. "You said you were embarrassed about needing help and asked me not to mention it to anyone else. How much money are we talking about total?" Carol tried to claim the recordings were taken out of context or edited to sound worse than they actually were, but Ryan had been thorough in his documentation. He played clip after clip of her making contradictory statements about family members, admitting to financial manipulation, and expressing satisfaction about her ability to control other people's relationships and decisions. The most devastating recording came last. Carol's voice was captured discussing her strategy for dealing with my independence and the threat it posed to her family authority. "Jackie thinks she can just walk away from family obligations and start fresh somewhere else," Carol said with unmistakable bitterness. "But I am not going to let her escape the consequences of challenging my authority. I will make sure every family member knows that she abandoned her sick mother and chose her own selfish interests over family loyalty. By the time I am finished, no one in this family will want anything to do with her." As the final recording ended, the room remained silent for what felt like hours. Family members stared at each other, at Carol, and at the recorder that had revealed the calculated cruelty behind years of family conflicts they had attributed to misunderstandings and personality differences. Carol's mask had been completely torn away, and everyone present could see the manipulative, vindictive person who'd been orchestrating family dramas while positioning herself as the victim of other people's unreasonable behavior. The silence following Ryan's recording stretched on until Carol realized that no one was going to rescue her from the devastating evidence that had just been presented. Her face cycled through expressions of panic calculation and finally pure rage as she understood that her carefully constructed public persona had been completely destroyed in front of the family members whose opinions mattered most to her. "Those recordings are illegal," she said, her voice rising to a pitch I had rarely heard from her. "Ryan violated my privacy by secretly recording private conversations, and nothing he captured can be trusted because he edited out the context that would explain my statements." "The recordings are not edited, Grandma," Ryan replied calmly, holding up the device so everyone could see its digital display. "This model shows the total recording time and any breaks or modifications. These are complete conversations, and everyone in this room just heard you admit to lying, stealing, and manipulating family relationships for your own entertainment." Mark was still standing, his face red, with an anger that seemed to be building rather than dissipating as he processed what he had heard. "Mom, you threatened my son's college fund to control his relationship with his aunt. You used his love for family against him to turn him into a spy in his own home. How could you do that to a 17-year-old kid?" But instead of showing remorse or attempting to repair the damage, Carol's response revealed the full extent of her narcissistic rage when confronted with consequences for her behavior. "You want to know why I did it?" she screamed, her weakness and vulnerability forgotten as pure venom poured out of her. "Because your precious sister was always your father's favorite, and I was tired of being treated like a stranger in my own marriage." The The room went completely still as Carol continued her tirade, apparently deciding that since her manipulation had been exposed, she might as well reveal the truth that had motivated years of calculated cruelty. Every conversation I tried to have with your father ended up being about Jackie's accomplishments, or Jackie's problems, or Jackie's future plans. He spent more time thinking about her career than he ever spent thinking about our marriage. When she would visit, the two of them would talk for hours about subjects I knew nothing about, making me feel like an outsider in my own home. Susan tried to interrupt, but Carol was beyond reason, now releasing decades of suppressed resentment with the force of a dam bursting. And then he got sick, and do you know what he talked about during his final weeks? Not our 40-year marriage or the life we had built together. He talked about making sure Jackie would be protected from my jealousy. My jealousy. As if wanting my husband's attention was some kind of character flaw that made me dangerous to his precious daughter. David sat back down heavily, his expression showing the dawning realization that Carol's abuse of multiple family members had been motivated by a twisted form of competition with a dead man's memory. He told me before he died that Jackie was the child he was most proud of. Carol continued, tears streaming down her face, but her voice remaining sharp with decades of accumulated bitterness. Not you, Mark, even though you are his son. Not our successful family business or our financial stability. He said Jackie was his greatest accomplishment because she had become exactly the kind of person he had hoped to raise. The confession was devastating not just because of what it revealed about Carol's motivations, but because of how it reframed every interaction she had had with our family since my father's death. Her cruelty toward me had been an extension of her resentment toward him, and her manipulation of other family members had been driven by a desperate need to prove that she deserved the love and attention he had given to me. So yes, I tried to drive her away, Carol admitted with a defiance that seemed to grow stronger as she spoke. Yes, I recorded her conversations and built a case to prove she was unstable. Yes, I turned family members against her by sharing information that made her look selfish and unreliable. And yes, I enjoyed watching her suffer, because for once in her life, she was not getting everything handed to her on a silver platter. Mark sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. Mom-Dad loved you too. He married you and built a life with you for 40 years. Jackie's relationship with him was not a competition that you lost. That is not how it felt, Carol snapped back. That is not how it felt when he would light up whenever she called, or when he would spend hours reading her college papers because he was so interested in her thoughts and opinions. That is not how it felt when his last coherent words were instructions about protecting her from me instead of expressions of love for the wife who had devoted her life to taking care of him. The room fell silent again as everyone processed the depth of Carol's resentment and the calculating nature of her revenge against both my father's memory and my current happiness. She had systematically destroyed family relationships and manipulated multiple people's lives because she could not accept that her husband had loved his daughter without loving his wife less. Sarah finally spoke into the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Aunt Carol Jackie was not responsible for how Uncle Robert expressed his love for you. She was just being his daughter. How could you punish her for having a close relationship with her father? Carol's response revealed the final piece of her psychological puzzle and the complete absence of empathy that had made her capable of such sustained cruelty. Because she got to keep his love even after he died, Carol said with chilling matter-of-factness. She got the inheritance, the property, the financial security, and the family's respect for being his favorite. I got nothing but the responsibility of being his widow and watching everyone treat his memory like he was a saint who never made any mistakes. But you chose to respond to that pain by hurting innocent people, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the recordings had begun. You chose to destroy relationships and manipulate family members instead of processing your grief and finding healthy ways to honor both Dad's memory and your own contributions to the family. Carol turned to look at me with eyes that held no trace of motherly love or even basic human warmth. I chose to make sure you experienced some of the isolation and rejection that I lived with for years, while your father treated you like you were more important than anyone else in his life." The hatred in her voice was so pure and concentrated that it actually felt like a relief to hear it expressed openly, rather than disguised behind false concern and manipulative tactics. For the first time in our relationship, Carol was being completely honest about her feelings toward me, and her honesty revealed a person who was fundamentally incapable of love or genuine human connection. The aftermath of Carol's confession created a strange kind of relief in the hospital conference room, as if a poison that had been slowly contaminating our family for years had finally been identified and could now be properly addressed. But the silence also carried the weight of everyone present, trying to recalculate their understanding of family history and their own relationships with each other. Mark was the first to break the quiet, pulling out his phone and scrolling through what appeared to be financial records. His expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed information that was obviously connected to Carol's recorded admissions about borrowing money under false pretenses. "I need to share something with everyone," Mark said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled anger. "After hearing those recordings, I spent yesterday going through 5 years of bank statements and loan documentation. Mom has not just been borrowing money from family members, she has been systematically defrauding us." He pulled out a manila folder similar to the one Susan had brought to Portland months earlier, but this one contained bank statements, canceled checks, and printed emails that painted a picture of financial manipulation far more extensive than anyone had realized. "In the past 5 years, she has requested emergency financial assistance from me 7 times. Mark continued spreading documents across the conference table for everyone to examine. Each time, she provided detailed explanations about urgent expenses that required immediate help. But when I cross-referenced her stories with actual expenses and bank deposits, nothing matches up." Susan leaned forward to examine the documentation, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition to pure anger as she processed what Mark had discovered. "She told me she needed $3,000 for emergency car repairs after an accident," Mark explained, pointing to a check dated 18 months earlier. "But I called the repair shop she mentioned, and they have no record of any work done on her car during that time period. The money was deposited into her checking account and withdrawn in cash the same day." David grabbed another set of papers and found records related to his own loans to Carol. "This one shows the $6,000 I gave her for medical expenses that insurance supposedly would not cover. But look at this bank statement from the same week. The money was transferred to an online gaming account not used for any medical bills." As family members compared documentation, a pattern emerged that was even more sophisticated and calculating than the emotional manipulation Ryan had recorded. Carol had maintained detailed records of each family member's financial situation, their emotional vulnerabilities, and their past responses to requests for help. She had crafted her fraud attempts to exploit specific psychological triggers that would make each person feel guilty for hesitating to provide assistance. "She asked me for money right after Tom lost his job," Susan realized, referring to her husband's brief unemployment the previous year. "She knew we were stressed about our own finances, so she made the request sound urgent enough that refusing would have made me feel like a terrible sister. And she asked me for help during my wife's pregnancy." Mark added, "When she knew we were already worried about medical expenses and time off work. She timed the request perfectly to maximize my sense of family obligation." The total amount of fraudulent loans exceeded $63,000 across 6 family members over 5 years. But the financial damage was only part of the harm Carol had caused. Her systematic lying had created artificial stress in family relationships, forced people to make difficult financial decisions based on false information, and generated guilt and resentment that had damaged multiple marriages and friendships. The worst part is not even the money. David said, his voice shaking with emotion. The worst part is that she watched me stress about whether I could afford to help with her fake emergency, and she enjoyed seeing me struggle with the decision. She used my love for family against me to manipulate me into giving her money she was going to waste on gambling. Carol had remained silent during this financial reckoning, her earlier rage apparently exhausted by her brutal confession about jealousy and revenge. But her expression showed no remorse or shame about the fraud documentation being presented. If anything, she seemed annoyed that her careful planning had been discovered, rather than sorry that she had caused financial and emotional harm to multiple family members. Sarah's daughter, Emma, who was 17 like Ryan, finally spoke up from her corner chair, where she had been quietly observing the adult drama with obvious confusion and discomfort. Why would someone do this to their own family? She asked, her voice carrying the honest bewilderment of someone too young to understand the psychology behind sustained manipulation and abuse. If Grandma Carol was lonely or sad about Grandpa, why didn't she just talk to people about those feelings instead of hurting everyone? The question hung in the air because none of the adults present could provide an answer that would make sense to a teenager who had grown up in a relatively healthy family environment. Carol's behavior was fundamentally irrational and cruel, motivated by psychological patterns that were alien to people who approached relationships with empathy and good faith. Some people cannot handle emotional pain in healthy ways. I finally responded to Emma, choosing my words carefully to provide education without creating fear. Instead of processing difficult feelings through therapy or honest conversation, they choose to make other people suffer as a way of feeling less powerless about their own problems. But that does not actually solve anything, Emma pointed out with the clarity that sometimes comes from youth. It just creates more problems and makes everyone feel worse. You are absolutely right, Susan agreed. That is why this behavior is considered abusive rather than just difficult or complicated. Healthy people do not choose to hurt others as a way of managing their own emotional pain. Mark closed his financial documentation and looked directly at Carol for the first time since her rage-filled confession. Mom, you have committed fraud against multiple family members, and you have psychologically abused a 17-year-old kid by threatening his future to control his relationships. We cannot ignore this behavior or pretend it was just family drama that got out of hand. Carol's response was a shrug that conveyed complete indifference to the harm she had caused and the consequences she might face. You all got along fine without me before, and you will get along fine without me again. Do whatever you think is best for your precious family unity. The dismissive tone and lack of accountability confirmed what everyone in the room was beginning to understand. Carol was not going to change, apologize genuinely, or take responsibility for the pain she had deliberately caused. Any future relationship with her would require accepting that she was fundamentally committed to manipulation and control, rather than love and mutual support. The meeting concluded with Mark volunteering to coordinate the family's response to Carol's fraud and abuse, but it was Susan who made the call that would ultimately force accountability. As a retired legal secretary with 40 years of experience in family court, she understood that Carol's behavior had crossed the line from family conflict into criminal territory. Monday morning, Susan contacted the district attorney's office in Summit County and provided documentation of the systematic financial fraud Carol had perpetrated against multiple family members. The prosecutor assigned to review the case, Jennifer Walsh, was coincidentally the same woman who had served as Carol's nurse during her hospitalization and had documented her medicated confessions. Jennifer explained that the combination of recorded admissions, bank documentation, and witness testimony created a strong case for charges of elderly abuse fraud and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. However, she also noted that prosecuting family members for financial abuse often created additional trauma for victims and rarely resulted in meaningful restitution. What we typically recommend in cases like this: Jennifer explained during a conference call with Mark, Susan, and me, is a structured settlement agreement that provides accountability and protection for family members while avoiding the stress and expense of criminal prosecution. The settlement proposal Jennifer outlined would require Carol to undergo mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment, establish a formal repayment plan for stolen funds, and agree to supervise contact with family members under court monitoring. Most importantly, it would include legal protections that prevented Carol from accessing or influencing Ryan's education funds and other vulnerable family assets. But when Carol's court-appointed attorney, Michael Torres, presented this settlement offer, her response revealed the depth of her narcissistic personality and her fundamental inability to accept responsibility for her actions. "I am not admitting to any wrongdoing," Carol declared during a meeting in Torres's office that included Mark and Susan as family representatives. Family members give each other financial assistance all the time, and if people want to characterize that generosity as fraud, that says more about their vindictiveness than my behavior. Torres, who had 30 years of experience with family legal disputes, immediately recognized that his client was demonstrating exactly the kind of manipulative thinking that had created the current crisis. "Mrs. Martinez," he said patiently, "the prosecution has recordings of you admitting that you deliberately lied to family members about how you intended to use their money. You specifically stated that you enjoyed deceiving them and that you used their assistance for gambling rather than the emergencies you described. That constitutes fraud under Ohio state law." "Those recordings were made by a minor without my knowledge," Carol countered, "and they have been edited to make my statements sound worse than they actually were." Torres reviewed the technical analysis that had been performed on Ryan's recordings and confirmed that they showed no evidence of editing or manipulation. More problematically for Carol's case, the recordings included her own voice explaining her techniques for manipulating family members, which demonstrated intent to commit fraud, rather than simple misunderstanding about family financial assistance. Furthermore, Torres continued, "Your son Mark has provided bank statements showing that you deposited family assistance directly into online gambling accounts, which contradicts every explanation you gave for needing the money. The prosecution can prove systematic deception over multiple years with multiple victims." The legal reality was that Carol faced potential felony charges that could result in significant jail time and permanent criminal record. The settlement agreement represented the best possible outcome for someone who had committed the level of fraud documented by the family's evidence. But Carol's response to this legal pressure revealed the psychological rigidity that had made her capable of sustained abuse and manipulation for years. "If my own family wants to destroy me through the legal system," she said with cold finality, "then they deserve everything they get when this becomes public knowledge, and everyone in town knows how Jackie Martinez's family treats elderly widows who are guilty of nothing more than poor judgment." The threat was vintage Carol, an attempt to use shame and social embarrassment to control other people's decisions, even when she held no actual power to carry out her intimidation tactics. She was essentially threatening to embarrass herself publicly as a way of manipulating family members into dropping their demands for accountability. Torres recognized the tactical stupidity of Carol's approach and took a much more direct stance than she was accustomed to from people in authority positions. "Mrs. Martinez, you seem to misunderstand your situation," he said bluntly. "You do not have leverage in this negotiation. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The prosecution has multiple cooperating witnesses, and your own recorded statements provide proof of intent to commit fraud. Your choice is between a settlement agreement that allows you to avoid criminal prosecution or a trial that will almost certainly result in felony conviction and jail time." The meeting ended with Carol refusing to sign the settlement agreement and demanding more time to consider her options. But Torres was clear that the offer would not remain available indefinitely. That evening, Susan called me in Portland to update me on Carol's decision and its likely consequences. "Her lawyer thinks she's making a serious mistake," Susan explained. He believes the prosecution will file criminal charges within 2 weeks if she does not accept the settlement, but she seems convinced that the family will back down rather than put her through a public trial. Will the family back down? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Absolutely not, Susan replied firmly. Mark has talked to David and Sarah, and we are all committed to protecting Ryan and holding her accountable for the fraud. She has finally pushed us too far to enable her behavior anymore. As I ended the call, I realized that Carol's refusal to accept accountability was actually the best possible outcome for the family's long-term healing. A settlement agreement would have required ongoing contact and monitoring, but criminal prosecution would establish clear legal boundaries and permanent consequences that would protect everyone from future manipulation. 3 weeks after Carol's attorney informed the court that she would not accept the settlement agreement, criminal charges were formally filed against her for elder abuse fraud and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The local newspaper's court reporting section included a brief mention of the case, but the coverage was limited to basic facts without sensational details about family conflicts. I was reviewing mediation case files in my Portland office when my phone rang with a call from an unfamiliar Los Angeles number. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Chen, a producer for a major television network who specialized in documentary programming about family relationships and social issues. Ms. Martinez, I am calling because your story has come to our attention through professional networks in the family mediation field, Marcus explained. We are developing a documentary series about people who have successfully escaped toxic family dynamics and rebuilt their lives while helping other families navigate similar challenges. The opportunity was both exciting and terrifying. Marcus outlined a program that would focus on my professional success as a family mediator, while exploring the personal journey that had led to my expertise in recognizing and responding to manipulative relationship patterns. We are particularly interested in your work with the Hartwell Family Foundation, Marcus continued. Amanda Richardson has spoken very highly of your partnership and the innovative approaches you have developed for addressing family-business conflicts. We think your story could help other people recognize similar patterns in their own families. The documentary would require me to discuss Carol's manipulation tactics and my decision to establish independence from family toxicity, but it would frame those experiences as the foundation for my current work, helping other families heal from similar dynamics. The focus would be on transformation and empowerment rather than family drama or personal revenge. After consulting with Amanda and my therapist, I agreed to participate in the documentary project. The filming process took 6 months and included interviews with family members who had been affected by Carol's manipulation clients, whose families I had helped mediate, and other professionals working in the field of family psychology and toxic relationship recovery. The most meaningful part of the documentary was a segment featuring Ryan, who had graduated high school and was thriving in his first year at Ohio State University. His college fund had been protected from Carol's influence through the legal settlement, and he had used his experience surviving her manipulation to develop remarkable insight into healthy relationship dynamics. Working with Aunt Jackie taught me that family love should never require you to sacrifice your own well-being or accept treatment that makes you feel bad about yourself, Ryan explained during his interview. Real family support means wanting each person to grow and succeed as individuals, not demanding compliance with someone else's emotional needs. The documentary aired 9 months later and generated overwhelming response from viewers who recognized similar patterns in their own family relationships. My mediation practice, which had already expanded significantly through referrals from the Hartwell Foundation work, exploded with new client requests from across the country. Amanda and I hired 4 additional mediators and established satellite offices in Seattle and San Francisco to handle the demand for our services. We developed specialized training programs for therapists and social workers who wanted to incorporate family business mediation into their practice, and we began consulting with other professionals who worked with families escaping toxic dynamics. The most rewarding aspect of this professional growth was that every day brought opportunities to help people recognize manipulation tactics, establish healthy boundaries, and rebuild their lives free from the psychological control that had once defined their family relationships. But the personal transformation was even more significant than the professional success. Mark and his family moved to Columbus only 2 hours from my Portland office, and we began building the kind of authentic sibling relationship that had been impossible under Carol's influence. Susan became a regular visitor to Portland, and David started bringing his family for annual vacation trips that allowed our families to connect without the stress and drama that had previously defined our gatherings. Most importantly, I had learned to distinguish between family obligation and family love. The people who gathered around my dining table for holidays were there because they chose to support and enjoy each other's company, not because genetic relationships or social expectations required their presence. Ryan became a regular fixture in my home during his summer breaks, working as an intern with our mediation practice, while developing his own interest in family psychology and conflict resolution. Watching him grow into a confident young adult who could recognize and resist manipulation tactics felt like proof that breaking cycles of family dysfunction was possible and worthwhile. The most unexpected development came 18 months after the documentary aired when I received a letter forwarded through my attorney from Carol, who was serving a suspended sentence and mandatory community service in lieu of jail time. The letter from Carol arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, almost exactly 2 years after her devastating birthday declaration that had started this entire journey. I held the envelope for several minutes before opening it, preparing myself for one final manipulation attempt or a self-serving request for reconciliation that would ignore her accountability for the harm she had caused. But when I finally read her carefully handwritten words, I was surprised to discover what appeared to be the first genuine apology Carol had ever offered for her manipulative behavior. Jackie. The letter began, "I have spent the past year in court-mandated therapy learning about the psychological patterns that drove my behavior toward you and other family members. My therapist has helped me understand that my jealousy about your relationship with your father was my problem to solve, not your burden to carry." The letter continued for 3 pages, with Carol acknowledging specific manipulative tactics she had used, expressing remorse for the financial fraud that had harmed multiple family members, and taking responsibility for the emotional abuse that had driven me away from Ohio. "I realize now that I spent years punishing you for having the kind of close relationship with your father that I wished I could have had with him," Carol wrote. "Instead of working on my own insecurities and communication problems, I chose to destroy your happiness as a way of managing my own pain. That was cruel and unforgivable." The most significant part of the letter was Carol's acknowledgement that genuine healing would require respecting my boundaries rather than demanding immediate forgiveness or resumed contact. "I am not asking you to trust me again or welcome me back into your life," Carol concluded. "I am asking if you would consider allowing me to earn your respect over time through consistent, respectful behavior, while accepting that you have every right to maintain whatever boundaries you need to protect your own well-being." I showed the letter to my therapist, to Amanda, and to Mark before deciding how to respond. Everyone agreed that Carol's words represented a significant departure from her historical patterns of manipulation and self-justification, but they also cautioned that lasting change would need to be demonstrated through actions rather than promises. After careful consideration, I decided to respond with a letter outlining specific conditions that would be necessary for any future contact between us. These included continuing therapy, complete honesty about her past behavior, if asked respect for my professional boundaries, and acceptance that rebuilding trust would be a gradual process that might take years. Carol's response arrived 6 weeks later, agreeing to all my conditions and providing documentation that she was maintaining regular therapy appointments and had completed financial restitution to all family members she had defrauded. We began with brief monthly phone calls during which Carol demonstrated the kinds of communication skills she had apparently learned in therapy. She asked thoughtful questions about my work and my life without demanding personal details I was not ready to share. She acknowledged family events and achievements without positioning herself as central to our celebrations. Most importantly, she accepted my boundaries without argument or attempts to negotiate for more access than I was comfortable providing. The first in-person meeting took place 8 months later when Carol flew to Portland for a carefully structured visit that included only public activities and no overnight stays in my home. She met Amanda and toured our mediation practice offices, expressing genuine pride in my professional accomplishments without claiming credit for my success or attempting to insert herself into my business relationships. The visit was not emotionally healing in any dramatic sense, but it was respectful and peaceful in a way that our relationship had never been before. Carol demonstrated that she could interact with me as an independent adult, rather than as an extension of her own emotional needs, and I discovered that I could feel compassion for her psychological struggles without accepting responsibility for managing her feelings. Our relationship today is limited, but genuine. We speak every few weeks, usually about practical matters or family news, rather than deep emotional processing. Carol attends family gatherings when invited, but she no longer attempts to control other people's relationships or manipulate group dynamics for her own benefit. The transformation has been remarkable but fragile. Carol's changed behavior appears to be the result of intensive psychological work rather than strategic manipulation. But I remain vigilant for signs that she might revert to her historical patterns if her therapy ends or if she faces new emotional stresses. Most importantly, I have learned that healing from family toxicity does not require reconciliation or forgiveness. It requires establishing boundaries that protect your well-being while remaining open to authentic change if and when it occurs. The greatest lesson from this entire experience has been understanding the difference between family obligation and family love. True family relationships are built on mutual respect, support, and genuine care for each other's happiness and growth. Genetic connections or social expectations alone cannot sustain healthy relationships if they are not supported by authentic emotional bonds and respectful behavior. Today, my dining table in Portland is often filled with people who have chosen to be part of my life because we enjoy and support each other, not because genetic relationships or social obligations require our presence. Mark and his family visit regularly. Ryan spends his summers working with our mediation practice, and Susan has become one of my closest friends and professional mentors. The family I have built through choice and mutual respect is stronger and more loving than the family I inherited through birth because it is based on authentic connection rather than fear, obligation, or emotional manipulation. My work helping other families navigate similar toxic dynamics has shown me that breaking cycles of abuse and manipulation is not only possible but necessary for creating space where genuine love and support can flourish. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is showing them the consequences of their behavior, because accountability creates the possibility for real change and authentic relationships. The pain Carol caused me ultimately became the foundation for helping hundreds of other families recognize manipulation tactics, establish healthy boundaries, and rebuild their relationships on stronger, more honest foundations. If you have experienced family manipulation or emotional abuse, I want you to know that choosing your own well-being over keeping the peace is not selfish. It is necessary. Family love should never require you to accept treatment that damages your mental health or forces you to compromise your authentic self. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members to protect your own well-being? How did you find the courage to prioritize your mental health over family expectations? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Please like this video if it resonated with your own family experiences. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming toxic relationships and building healthy boundaries, and share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding that they deserve to be treated with respect and genuine love by the people who claim to care about them. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your happiness and mental health are worth protecting even when that protection requires difficult decisions about family relationships. You deserve to be surrounded by people who celebrate your growth rather than punish your independence.